Hey there, everyone. We're moving into part 3 of our conversation on recovery of function and motor learning. Okay, so earlier we talked about implicit and explicit knowledge. This is an interesting idea as we think about as one shifts to the other. Practice is typically the basis of switching from implicit to explicit. So in other words, a ton of reps can kind of cause that chemical shift from one to the other. It's interesting in that you can kind of play with both at the same time, because use of both memory systems together, implicit and explicit, is actually what's supposed to happen, yeah? But one thing I do want you to focus on here, and this is why the star gets a green slide, is actually this part right here. So when you have explicit learning of something, you actually want it to become implicit, right? Like you want it to be automatic. You don't have to think about doing a skill. The motor cortex is very energy intensive, and it's up in the frontal lobe, right? So that's where, that's active thinking. As explicit starts to become implicit, other parts of the brain take over and become more active, which is a good thing. We want that. So you have a shift from M1 to other parts, okay? Other regions, which we're going to abbreviate. I'll go ahead and spell it. I think I have enough room. So M1 to other regions, okay? That's what you've got going on here. It's important to remember that this is a very good thing from an energy standpoint, okay? M1 is expensive to use energetically. Other regions, not as much. So that's the shift, okay? So really, I could put that it's implicit to explicit and explicit to implicit. It's back and forth. Okay, motor learning. So you've got simple forms like operant and classical conditioning. You've got complex forms like the acquisition of skilled movements. But really, what you're looking for is to get an increase in what again? The efficiency of stuff that isn't M1. Yeah? Yeah. So when movement happens, you have M1 and these thalamocortical pathways turned on at the same time. Over time, though, we want this one's activation to go down and this one's activation to go up, okay? So this situation here represents a good thing from an energy standpoint. Again, you want things to be automatic. So as things shift to automatic, that's something we really want to see through as a PT. And this is what really bums me out all the time as a clinician, is that we have to get these things automatic. Otherwise, that's not a person who's fully ready for community and life and their life roles and all that. You really need to be able to dual task is the thing. So you need automaticity right here to increase in a skilled movement. That way the person can do stuff like walk and talk, right? You only have so much attention. And if you're spending all your attention deliberately thinking about walking, you really can't function in the world. You just don't have enough bandwidth, okay? So with our patients who've had neurologic injury, if we push them into the world too fast, they're going to end up like this picture here, which is silly, but it gets the idea. I will tell you a clinical story about a patient I had once. This individual had had a stroke. He's in his late 40s, maybe 48 thereabouts. Nice guy. He worked at a place that sold sports equipment. And for whatever reason, they did things super old school, and their customers really liked that. And that people would call in, that's right, actually call in on landlines and place orders for various sports equipment. And they did this, and they were very good at it. They did a lot of sales in that way, in that old-fashioned way, instead of just placing online orders. So that's what he did all day. Here's the thing. He had to know the catalog, and he had to surf his computer to find whatever, thing on their website to actually place the order, and he had to know what the clients were talking about. And the motor aspects of the stroke were pretty much gone. He had actually finished a lot of rehab, but gosh, he could not dual task. He could not type and talk on the phone. That was specifically what he couldn't do. Anytime that happened, he was getting a headache. So I took a look at him. He came to see me for this, and the headache sometimes came with a dizziness attribute. And so that's part of why I've seen him. I see the dizzy ones. And his fingers would get super, just the coordination was gone. They get super sloppy. And so from watching him, all I could think was it's clear you don't have enough bandwidth to dual task, but where's this coming from and how can I change it? So I wasn't quite sure where it was coming from, but I figured I could change it with a slow progression up on dual tasking, paying attention to heart rate. And so that's what we did. I realized I had a pulse oximeter on him most of the time when we were practicing things. We started doing non-work related dual tasking that got his heart rate up so that he could kind of get used to that as an idea. And so that I think, honestly, part of his blood pressure control was just what we call labile, L-A-B-I-L-E. It was too willing to get high too fast. And that's the thing that happens all the time now after COVID. But basically, it's just that he didn't have good bandwidth, and so the minute that happened, it was more energy intensive. The heart rate goes up, and he gets a headache, and so it was almost like his motor patterns for dual tasking were not set enough, and the fatigue from dual tasking just ruined his motor control. Like the synapses just weren't strong enough yet. So we worked a lot on unrelated dual tasking at first, just because psychologically I thought that would be more pleasant, and then we slowly worked it up. And I gotta tell you, at the end, I had this guy like running up and down the gym that we had for the clinic. Like we had this long hallway, and I'm yelling, orders at him. Hi, I'd like a soccer goal. And he'd be like, what color? I'd be like, red and pink. Where do you want the pink? On the netting only. Like whatever. Stuff like that. It just to get him to, put those together. And so then once he sat down and okay, now we're not running. Let's try your hands now, okay? Because that's not the same thing. We need to practice what you're actually doing. And slowly we eased him into it. And so that's the idea of like building up his bandwidth for dual tasking from a heart rate perspective. As well as, he was doing a physical thing too that's supposed to be automatic. Like jogging up and down should be automatic. Typing on your keyboard should be automatic. And we slowly built that back up. He also usually had an HEP of just typing. I would send him home with one of those. I know if y'all probably didn't have to use these, but that's like a how to learn to type program. So yeah, I sent him home with like Mavis Beacon homework. I'm like, all right, you have a certain words per minute goal. Yeah, it worked really well. I only had him for about 4 weeks, so he did great. Okay, so that's my bandwidth example. That's a fun one. Okay, neuroplasticity and recovery of function. Okay, so I have here a very specific example in that sometimes a stroke occurs because of a blood clot. So normally you have blood flowing up to the brain, but then there's a clot. And so then there's no blood here at this part of the brain. And so that means that tissue is going to die, right? It's an anoxic thing. It needs oxygen. If it can't get it, then you have a problem. There's a drug that they can give people called tissue plasminogen activator, abbreviated as TPA. And it dissolves the clot and then allows the blood to flow through again. With any luck, you time it fast enough so that this doesn't completely die and you can get some back. That some back is sometimes spontaneous recovery, sometimes it's not. So this one usually occurs independent of external interventions, and this is an external intervention, but I think it gets the idea of it. So sometimes things just get better on their own, which is good. Sometimes we have to make things get better. That's physical therapy. Sometimes things get better, and it's kind of a strange thing. Like it's probably things taking over. So we'll dig into more of this as we go, as we get into abnormal mobility. Okay, so neuroplasticity and the recovery of function. So sometimes things happen right off the bat that kind of create a lot of challenges in recovery. One of those is axonal damage. So most injuries to your CNS and PNS actually do involve damage to axons. And sometimes the axon can actually rip into two pieces, and this is called an axotomy. And you lose that neuron. You lose the pathway, and it accentuates the injury. So this is an MRI of a brain that's healthy, very healthy. Look at all the beautiful structures. You can see the internal capsule. That's like perfect. See right there? That's internal capsule. Here. Beautiful, beautiful white matter. And then basal ganglia. That's all these little buddies here, right? Look at all the individual gyri. Gorgeous, right? You can see where all your CSF hangs out, nice and chill. But up here, we don't see any of that, yeah? Note how the ventricles, which are so clear right here, are full of fluid. The gyri and sulci, you just can't even tell the difference between them. This person has had what is called a diffuse axonal injury, a DAI. You don't need to know that. What you do need to know is that the axons have been severed, and the response afterward is fluid, okay? So when I see one of these, back when I was working hospital side, I know that person's probably not going to wake up. They might not survive, and if they do, the neurologist determines brain death, right? But this is almost not appropriate for physical therapy. That brain is not working, yeah? So The neurons, mind you, are basically fine, but the axons are torn. And when things can't talk to each other, it's just done. Yeah? Okay, so early on, sometimes you get something very unusual called diaskesis. And this is kind of a hard one to describe. So I have this picture right here. Okay, so let's say this is the brain. Yeah. Here is this person's left and this person's right. And they have a stroke which kills this part of the brain. This image here is a PET, which has to do with brain activation. The more warm the color is, the more it's activated. In other words, the more red it is, the more it's activated, okay? The more blue it is, the less it's activated. And if it's black, there's no activation, which makes sense. This person has had a stroke. This tissue is dead, therefore there's no activity. Now, what you see, so this is the left side, which means it's responsible for the other side of the body, yeah? So it's responsible for the right side of the body. What's interesting is you can see here, look right here, that's not as red as this side, yeah? Remember, the cerebellum is same-sided. This is responsible for the right side. Note how it's more green, this is more red. These two are linked, yes? Nothing has happened stroke-wise to injure the cerebellum, and yet look how it's less activated on that same side. That is diaskesis. So this is typically transient. It's loss of function in a structurally intact brain area. And the idea is those two areas are supposed to talk to each other. And so the loss of that excitation produces a loss of function in the regions that are adjacent or generally, functionally connected to an area that is the primary site of damage. It's almost like shock. So if you think of it as shock, that's pretty accurate. It's a loss of excitation. It's not inhibition, it's a loss of excitation. So with any luck, it resolves, but there's a lot of nuance there, but in essence, basically they're friends and this one gets sad and so it's not doing its job, yeah? And with any luck, it can turn back on, which is good because God, you need coordination, but yeah. Okay, these two are actually probably occurring back here on this image here. So note all the fluid? Yes. Okay, so this is probably two things. I mean, most likely vasogenic edema. So after injury, you get a lot of fluid, just like if you roll your ankle and it gets all swollen. Kind of the same thing in the brain. It's just this general idea of injury happens, inflammation occurs. The natural process of inflammation, which is supposed to be a good thing, means that in order to get in all those immune mediators and little helper cells and glia and all that awesomeness, you need fluid. So vasogenic edema can happen in that context. In addition, you have damage, which means some things have ripped, fluid's going where it's not supposed to go. Also, without getting too hard into the neurophysiology, individual cells can swell and lyse, they rupture. And so that also creates a lot of fluid on the brain, to the point where there are actually conditions that have this. So these are MRIs demonstrating patients with cytotoxic edema and those with vasogenic edema. So up here, we have a 25-year-old woman who's post-delivery. She developed eclampsia, and this here shows that she has quite a bit of edema. And this is cytotoxic edema, though. Now, this one down here is a person with vasogenic edema. So remember, this one is the cells getting full of fluid and bursting. This one is the space between, yeah? The space between. So these are both extremely dangerous. This is why they say, you really want to pay attention to the signs and symptoms of eclampsia when you're pregnant, because really, really terrible things can happen to you. This person down here, 27-year-old, had nephritis somehow, caused hypertension, and gave him a blood pressure of 180 over 120. One of the reasons you don't want your blood pressure too high is that when it's in the brain and it's that high, you can just have spontaneous rupture of the vessels. And it doesn't take as much blood pressure as you would think to make that happen. And yeah, it's more for your second year. We'll get to that. Okay, neuroplasticity and recovery of function, axonal regeneration. Where does it happen? Not in the CNS. Where does it happen? Yes, the PNS. All right, that's all you needed from there. So yeah, pretty simple. So remember, this is a PNS situation. You really do not get axonal regen in the PNS, but you do in the, you do not get it in the CNS, you do in the PNS. Yay. Okay, here. So this part we're going to kind of cruise through just a little bit because it's better to go over it in person in class, okay? Because it gets pretty detailed quickly, a lot of images, things like that. And in the interest of not taking all of your time before class, we're going to go over this more during class with some activities, okay? So if you want, and I highly recommend it, read through these headings in your book, okay? So look at what all these different things are, because these are the responses of the CNS to injury. These are things that happen which are sometimes really good, sometimes not as good, okay? Let's look at an interesting example of remapping here as we wrap up. So remapping, so if you have a peripheral lesion, in other words, something happens to your arms or legs, then the body responds by remapping, yeah? By pushing certain areas of the brain into different responsibilities. This happens in central damage too, but let's focus on this first one here, this peripheral injury. So if somebody experiences a limb loss, so for example, if they lose their arm, that is all of this here, yeah? Look at all of these structures here responsible for arm. All of that brain is now not needed. And so sometimes the brain is like, yeah, you know what? We're gonna reassign this to other things. And so sometimes this happens in a good way, sometimes it happens in a not good way. And in amputees with phantom limb pain, that's actually what's happening here. They're getting a reorganization that's not super helpful. So what you have here is an fMRI of a person with limb loss and a person without limb loss. So this is the person without limb loss. This is the person without limb loss. And they asked this person to purse their lips and look at the parts of the brain that were activated. So basically in the person with limb loss, the arm area got activated when they told them to purse their lips, which makes sense because look, mouth is right next to it. So the brain basically moved things around. It happens. It's cortical map reorganization. It might not always be a reorganization that we want though. So what I want you to think about is, how on earth do you change that? Because you can. It's hard, but you can. Okay, so another one where we're going to go into it more during class. I'm kind of just gently introducing it here. This is the idea of remapping and during recovery. This is powerful stuff, okay? This is definitely the real heart of what we're doing with this material. All of that lead up was to get us to here. And this is another slide that's super awesome, but we are not going to test you on it other than just one. This one, 5. 5 is the only one I'm going to focus on for this first exam. And it's basically just the idea that I want to introduce to you very, very early, that if you really want something to be plastic, you better work hard enough. Yeah, and that's a heart rate, hard enough, okay? You're going to go into in-depth on all of these other 10 ones, which are all important in your second year. But for this first year, we're just going to make sure to hit that hard early. Intensity matters, okay? And that's a heart rate intensity. If you want to walk again, and maybe you have those genetic factors that say, I might not heal very well, you need that heart rate to get up there, okay? Okay, so as we're wrapping up here, I want you to be thinking about the regions of the brain associated with the different types of memory, remapping, how's that happening? How is this actually pretty similar to learning? What really is recovery for having parts of the brain take over for other things? And anything that we've marked as green and gold star. All right, see y'all in class.